In this part of the basic chemistry lecture, we are going to focus in on water and its unique properties. So the first thing you should know about water, I mentioned this in the previous lecture, is that water has a bent structure. It's two polar covalent bonds. Remember, that's an uneven sharing. The oxygen is the more electronegative atom in this compound because of the fact that it's got these two lone pairs of electrons. So the hydrogens end up with a partial positive charge, and the oxygen ends up with a partial or slight negative charge. And that allows water to then make hydrogen bonds, which remember are these dotted lines, with other water molecules. Up to 4 water molecules can bond to one in the center. Now, the thing about hydrogen bonds in the water molecules is that they do not last very long. In liquid water, these are lasting less than a second. So this is almost like shaking hands. It shakes hands with this water and breaks off and slides over here and shakes hands with this water. And so these are constantly being made and broken, but this is what keeps water liquid at room temperature. So the first property of water we're going to talk about is what a great solvent it is. So a solvent, if you don't remember from chemistry, a solvent dissolves things. A solute is what gets dissolved in the solvent. And water is often called the universal solvent, even though it is not universal. It does not dissolve everything, but it does dissolve other substances that are polar and typically dissolves most substances that are ionic. Why is that? There's this rule that like dissolves like, which means that things that have charges like to dissolve other things that have charges. And since water has partial charges, being polar, it has partial charges, it's going to dissolve other things that have these similar partial charges, and it's also going to dissolve ionic substances that have full charges. Sodium chloride and other salts, ionic compounds are oftentimes called salts as solids. They separate into ions in water. So water would pull this apart. Again, opposites attract here. So the oxygen of the water, which has the slight negative charge, it would be attracted to and pull apart the sodium part of the sodium chloride ion. The sodium would be attracted to the oxygen, whereas the chloride ion, the negative, it would be attracted to the hydrogen. So the attractions are going to be between the oppositely charged ions with the partial charges on the water. Now, things that dissolve in water are called hydrophilic, water-loving. Things that don't dissolve in water are called hydrophobic, which literally I think would actually translate to water-fearing, but we always just say water-hating. And interestingly, not only do those substances like oil, for example, and gasoline not like water, but they glob together in water. It's called hydrophobic exclusion. So in the little video, you can see this is like kinetic sand. It's got a coating on it that's non-polar. So it does not like the polar water. And when you put it in the water and then you lift it out, it comes out like completely dry because the water molecules just roll off of it. And the same is true with oil. It globs together because it doesn't like the water, but it does like other oil molecules. And so it kind of separates. Even if you shake up oil and vinegar, it's going to separate into 2 layers again. The second property is kind of a mix of a couple of things here. Water molecules are cohesive. They stick to each other. That's because of the hydrogen bonds. Substances that don't form hydrogen bonds a lot of times do not stick to one another as strongly as water molecules do. Water also sticks well to surfaces. And this is one of the reasons why it travels up plants. Capillary action is what we call it when water travels up thin tubes. You may have witnessed this if you've ever gone to the doctor and they prick your finger and you have that little drop of blood on your finger. It's a terrible drawing of a finger. This is the drop of blood. And then they take the capillary tube and they put it on there. It's a little teeny tiny tube and the blood magically goes up the tube. Well, that's because your blood is like 97% water. And so the blood is attracted to the glass of the capillary tube because glass is actually polar. And the water molecules are also attracted to each other. And so they just start moving up the glass until the blood will go like 3/4 of the way up the glass, and then they can test the little blood sample. The wider the tube, the less distance the water would be able to travel because it's not going to have as much attraction to the sides and keep moving upward. So this doesn't completely explain why water travels up plants. We're going to touch on that on another slide. So water also has a high surface tension. So for example, one of the things we'll do in the lab is we'll float a paperclip on water. Paper clips are aluminum typically, or some kind of alloy, and a paperclip is not less dense than water. It shouldn't float. Really, if you just drop a paperclip in there, it's going to sink. It doesn't come back up if you push it to the bottom. So it is not less dense than water, it's more dense. But the surface tension of the water, it's almost like this thin film that resists being broken. So here's why you get the surface tension. And you should know this. AP exam, they could actually ask you questions about surface tension or even have you draw in arrows to show surface tension. So a water molecule in the middle of a beaker of water is attracted by hydrogen bonds to all these water molecules around it. So it's getting kind of bombarded with these attractions from all sides. But a water molecule on the surface is not getting any attraction or pull from the top because it's air. So that's going to make it even stronger attractions between the water molecules that are nearby. And that's what creates surface tension. It's also why a belly flop floats. If you've ever jumped into a pool and you smack the water, it's resisting being broken. That surface tension is so strong that if you were to, dive off a high board and do a belly flop, you could rupture internal organs. You could break bones. You could break your neck because that resistance, that very quick resistance to the surface being broken, that surface tension is actually very, very strong. So here's a little more detail of why water travels up plants, which is a biological concept you should understand. First, when it rains, you've got all this water up here. Water's going to go into the roots by osmosis. You may remember that from biology. It's going to go from where there's more to where there's less. As it starts going in the roots, it's going to be attracted to the xylem. So xylem is little skinny tubes. Maybe you've done an experiment as a kid where you took celery, which looks something like this, and you put it in colored water, food coloring. And the celery has these little dots, which are the xylem going up the celery. And when you cut it, after you leave it there for like 24 hours, and you cut it, you can actually see the little dots where the food coloring was going up these little capillary tubes of xylem. So the water is attracted to the xylem by adhesion, and it's attracted to itself by cohesion. And then you have a third factor called transpiration. So at the leaves, you have these pores called stomata, and water is basically evaporating out. And that actually causes like a negative pressure, like a suction, that pulls the water up the leaves. So that's what's going on for water traveling up a plant. You have a mix of the water coming in at the roots, the cohesion and adhesion and capillary action, and then the transpiration at the leaves kind of pulling more water molecules up to replace them. All right, the next characteristic is that water is a very good temperature moderator, and that's because of something called specific heat. Specific heat is a measure of how much energy it takes to raise the temperature of 1 gram of substance by 1 degree Celsius. It's measured in joules, or maybe calories can be used to measure this. Water can absorb, in essence, water absorbs a lot of energy before it actually gets hotter. The hydrogen bonds contribute to this. And so you can have a lot of hot sun shining on your pool, but you'll notice your pool doesn't get that hot that fast. That's why water can absorb a lot of energy. We're made of 70% water. So when we go out in the sun, we don't immediately heat up. You go touch your car after it's been in the sun for 10 minutes and it's going to burn your hand. But your body isn't on fire. Why? Because water does not change its temperature very easily. It has the ability to hold on to energy. And so it warms very slowly and it cools very slowly. And this is important. This keeps temperatures moderate for all the living things in the environment. All right, it also has what we call a high heat of vaporization. This is a little different. This is the amount of energy it takes to convert liquid water into vapor, to evaporate the water. So because this takes a lot of energy, this is actually why sweat cools your body. So what happens is you sweat, the sweat comes out on your skin. That does not cool you. What cools you is the sweat evaporating. Where does it get the energy? Because it needs energy to evaporate, high heat of vaporization. It gets the energy from your body heat. So it's literally taking away body heat as it evaporates, and then therefore you are cooled down. So it's not the act of sweating that cools you, It's the evaporation of the sweat. It also has, and we don't talk so much about this one, but a high heat of fusion. Basically, you have to remove a lot of energy to turn it into ice. So overall, water is a fantastic temperature moderator on this planet because it really likes to stay a liquid. It doesn't like to turn into ice. It doesn't like to evaporate away, and this is why we have liquid water on the planet. So very unique thing, ice floats. You probably knew that ice floated, but you may not have ever really thought about how unique that actually is. We teach in chemistry that solids are more dense than liquids, and this breaks that rule. Solid water is less dense than liquid water. Water is actually the most dense at 4 degrees Celsius. It freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. So as it gets cold out, the water actually gets heavier or more dense, and that means in a lake, cold water will then sink, bring up warm water, and this will slow down a lake freezing over. And when it does eventually freeze, you're going to get this layer of ice, and that's going to protect all the organisms that live under the water. It's going to protect them from the cold air. It's going to protect them from freezing. So this is super important for living things because this is a protective coating almost in the wintertime, the fact that ice freezes on top. Now, here's why. Here's the kind of the molecular reason why ice floats. When the hydrogen bonds form in ice, they form this honeycomb structure. In other words, when water's a liquid, and I'll show you this in a picture, it'll be easier to explain. But this is also why if you've ever put a water bottle in the freezer and it bloated, or you put a soda in the freezer and forgot about it and it exploded, that's why. Because the ice takes up more space than the liquid, the aluminum can is not strong enough to handle that pressure, and so it cracks and it bursts. So here's what's actually happening. So in liquid water, these hydrogen bonds are being broken and reformed every couple of seconds. So when a hydrogen bond breaks, this water can slide past and join another one, and so these can slide very close to each other. But in ice, the hydrogen bonds, they lock in place. Now, these two water molecules are basically forced further apart than if they could break and reform new hydrogen bonds with other water molecules. And so that's what makes ice take up more space, is the locking of those hydrogen bonds in place. All right, acids and bases. So this is another one that you may not have gotten to in honors chem. So water breaks up a teeny little bit on its own. It breaks into hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. It's actually a very tiny amount. In a mole of water, if you remember that's 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd molecules of water, you have about 10 to the negative 7th hydrogen ions. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hydrogen ions, and 10 to the negative 7th hydroxide ions per mole. And these, in a neutral solution, these are equal to each other. But acids, for simplicity's sake, acids, we're going to say, produce positive ions, or we also call them protons because hydrogen only has one proton. So if you take away its electron, it's just a proton. It produces hydrogen ions in water. Hydrochloric acid is an example. Protons are actually used as a way of storing energy and forming a gradient that can pump things across a membrane. We'll talk about that in another chapter. Bases form hydroxide ions, or they also are thought of as pulling hydrogen ions out of a solution. Sometimes we call basic solutions alkaline. You should be familiar with that term, alkaline solution. It means it's basic. Now, how do we measure acids and bases? So acids and bases are measured using the pH scale. So the concentration of hydrogen, we take the negative log of that. You're not actually going to have to take a negative log. That becomes the pH. So for example, if the hydrogen concentration is 1 times 10 to the negative 7th, the pH is 7. When it's a whole number pH, which is the only kind we work with in bio, notice the pH is literally just the exponent made positive. Here's the important thing though. As the pH goes down by 1, the hydrogen concentration goes up 10 times. So if I go from pH 7 to pH 6, the hydrogen concentration goes up 10 times. If I go from 7 to 5, the hydrogen concentration goes up 10 times, times another 10 times, 100 times. You multiply. So the number of jumps in pH is going to be 10 times 10 times 10 for each one of those jumps. Below 7 is acid, and above 7 is a base. 7 is neutral.